Everything seemed locked in, alliances steady, narratives controlled, and the story, at least on the surface, made sense. Two longtime allies, one shared enemy, a familiar pattern the world had seen before. But then something didn't add up. Not in the headlines, not in the statements, not even in the reactions from within the system itself. Because behind the scenes, the message started to fracture. And when the message fractures, trust follows. This isn't just another geopolitical story. This is something deeper, something far more unsettling. Because what happens when allies don't just disagree, but start telling completely different versions of reality? And what happens when those contradictions begin shaping how millions of people see an entire country? That's where this story begins. Now, here's what really happened. The moment the first strikes were launched, it was already clear this wouldn't be a typical conflict. The timing alone raised eyebrows. Just one day before the escalation, new polling data revealed something historic, something that hadn't happened in decades. For the first time in the 21st century, Americans no longer sympathized more with Israelis than Palestinians. That shift might sound subtle, but in political terms, it's massive. Public opinion doesn't just change overnight. It moves slowly, often quietly, until suddenly it reaches a tipping point. And this looked like one of those moments. So when the conflict began, it wasn't launching into a climate of strong support. It was stepping into uncertainty, skepticism, even fatigue. And that's where things started to get complicated. Because in modern conflicts, perception matters almost as much as reality. And the perception of this war was unstable from the very beginning. But what really turned this into something bigger wasn't just the war itself. It was what people started saying about it. Let's rewind for a second. For years, the relationship between the United States and Israel has been described as unbreakable. Strategic, military, political. It's been one of the most consistent alliances in modern history. But alliances don't exist in a vacuum. They exist inside public opinion. And public opinion was shifting. At the same time, something else was happening, especially within parts of the American right. A growing divide, a tension that had been building quietly, now starting to surface more openly. Some influential voices began questioning Israel in ways that would have been unthinkable just a few years earlier. Not just policy disagreements, but deeper, more conspiratorial narratives, linking Israel to broader problems, suggesting hidden influence, raising suspicions. And once those ideas enter the conversation, they don't just disappear, they spread. So when the war began, it didn't just land in a divided political climate, it landed in a narrative battlefield. And then came the messaging. The first major moment came from the administration's attempt to explain why this conflict mattered to the United States. The argument sounded logical, at least at first. The idea was this: Israel was going to strike Iran no matter what. Iran would retaliate. And in that retaliation, American targets would be hit. So therefore, Iran posed an imminent threat to the United States. On paper, it made sense, but politically, it created a problem. Because if you listen closely, that argument implies something else. It suggests that the United States wasn't acting independently, but reacting to Israel's decisions. And that's a dangerous perception. No country wants to look like it's being pulled into a war by another nation, even an ally. So almost as quickly as that argument appeared, it disappeared, replaced by something else. But the damage had already begun. Because once people hear a narrative, even briefly, it sticks. And in this case, the narrative was simple and powerful. The United States is being dragged into a war. And that idea didn't stay confined to official statements. It started spreading outward, into media discussions, into political debates, into online communities. And then something happened that took this to an entirely different level. A resignation. Not just any resignation, but from someone inside the system. A high-level official stepping down and pointing directly at the war as the reason. That alone would have been significant. But what he said next, that's what made headlines. In his resignation, he didn't just criticize the conflict, he blamed it on Israel. Not subtly, not indirectly, but explicitly. He talked about pressure, influence, coercion. He connected this war to past conflicts. And then, in interviews afterward, he went even further, repeating ideas that many considered fringe, even conspiratorial. At that point, the reaction was swift. Many dismissed him, labeled his views extreme, questioned his credibility. But here's the part that matters. This wasn't just a random voice on the internet. This was someone who had been given authority, someone placed in a position of power, which meant, whether people agreed or not, his words carried weight. And once those words are out there, they become part of the narrative. They give shape to doubts that were already forming. They validate suspicions for some and raise new questions for others. And just as that controversy was unfolding, another moment hit. Late at night, a statement, short, direct, and immediately controversial. The claim? That the United States had no knowledge of a major Israeli strike, a strike that targeted a critical energy facility, one of the most significant in the region. Now think about that for a second. An operation of that scale, with global implications. And the claim is, we didn't know. That statement alone created shockwaves, because if true, it suggested a breakdown in coordination between allies. But if not true, it raised an entirely different set of concerns. And almost immediately, conflicting reports began to surface. Sources suggesting the U.S. was aware, others indicating coordination between the two countries. Experts pointing out how unlikely it would be for such an operation to happen without communication. So now, instead of one clear story, there were multiple versions, and each version told a different reality. But here's where it gets even more complicated. Even if the claim wasn't accurate, it still had an effect, because it reinforced a growing perception that Israel was acting independently, escalating the situation on its own, and that the United States was reacting, not leading. And in the world of public opinion, perception often becomes reality, especially when it aligns with existing doubts. Now add one more layer. The target of that strike wasn't just any facility. It was tied to one of the largest gas fields in the world, a critical piece of global energy infrastructure, which means this wasn't just a regional issue. It had global consequences. Energy markets, supply chains, economic stability, everything connected. And when Iran responded by targeting nearby infrastructure, the situation escalated even further. Now it wasn't just about military action. It was about the risk of wider instability. And in that environment, every statement matters. Every word can shift perception. And the messaging wasn't consistent. One moment suggesting coordination, another implying independence. Officials struggling to provide clear answers, questions being asked without solid responses. At one point, a senior intelligence official was asked directly about Israel's actions, why they happened, whether they aligned with U.S. objectives. And the response? Uncertainty, a pause, a careful attempt to answer without saying too much. Because the truth is, even within the system, clarity seemed limited. And that's where the real issue emerges. It's not just about what's happening. It's about whether anyone can clearly explain it. Because when explanations break down, trust follows. And when trust weakens, narratives fill the gap. Some grounded in fact, others driven by speculation, and some by conspiracy. Now step back for a moment and look at the bigger picture. You have a war that was already going to be difficult to justify to the public. You have shifting public opinion. You have internal divisions. And on top of that, you have inconsistent messaging from leadership. Each piece alone is manageable, but together, they create a perfect storm. Because now, instead of one clear story, there are multiple competing narratives. Some say the U.S. is leading. Others say it's being pulled in. Some see coordination. Others see independence. And when people don't know which version to believe, they start questioning everything. And that's where the real impact begins. Not just on policy, not just on strategy, but on perception, on reputation. Because once a country's image starts to shift, it's incredibly difficult to control. And for Israel, that shift may already be happening, not just because of actions on the ground, but because of how those actions are being framed and who is doing the framing. Even allies, intentionally or not, can shape that perception through what they say, through what they imply, through what they fail to clarify. And in this case, the messaging coming out of the administration may be doing exactly that, not by attacking Israel directly, but by creating space for doubt, for questions, for alternative interpretations. And once those take hold, they spread across media, across political groups, across social platforms, until they become part of the broader conversation. And that's something no country can easily control. Now here's where the tension really builds, because behind all of this is a deeper question. What are the actual objectives? Are both countries truly aligned, or are they pursuing different goals under the same alliance? At one point, an official acknowledged a key difference, that one side might be focused on leadership, while the other is focused on disarmament. Subtle difference, but significant, because it suggests that even within the alliance, priorities may not be identical. And when priorities diverge, coordination becomes more complex, and messaging becomes even more critical. But in this case, messaging hasn't been consistent, and that inconsistency may be shaping public perception in ways that go far beyond this conflict. Because once people start questioning the foundation of an alliance, they don't stop at one issue. They start looking at everything differently. Past decisions, future actions, underlying motives. And that's where things move from politics into something deeper, into trust, into belief, into how people understand the world around them. And that's why this story matters, because it's not just about a war. It's about how that war is being explained, how it's being perceived, and how those perceptions could shape the future, not just for one country, but for an entire relationship. Because if public opinion continues to shift, if narratives continue to fracture, if trust continues to weaken, then the consequences won't just be temporary, they'll be lasting, and possibly irreversible. Now here's the part that no one can fully predict. What happens next? Because the situation is still evolving, the messaging is still changing, the narratives are still being written, and in that uncertainty, anything is possible. All it takes is one more statement, one more contradiction, one more moment that doesn't quite add up, and the entire perception can shift again. That's the reality of modern conflicts. They're not just fought on the ground, they're fought in minds, in narratives, in the stories people choose to believe. And right now, that battle is far from over. Because this isn't just a story about war. It's a story about perception, about trust, about how quickly things can change when the message breaks down. And if there's one thing history has shown, it's that once those cracks begin to form, they rarely stay small. And this might just be the beginning.